Well, we're continuing the story of Kings, and now we're in the final days of the southern kingdom. So we finished with 2nd Chronicles chapter 35, where we saw the death of Josiah. And then in the next chapter, which is really the final chapter in Chronicles, we see the last days of the kingdom. So we find out in chapter 36, verse 1, it says, "Then the people of the land took Jehoiaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in place of his father." His reign is only going to be a very short time because Pharaoh Necho comes against Jerusalem and deposes him. So I want you to notice on the timeline where we are. We have Josiah, Jehoiaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, our last 4 kings. If you want to know the relationship between those kings, it's a little bit complicated. I would encourage you to look at 1 Chronicles 3 verse 15, which gives you their genealogy and it shows you the relationships. I'll mention a couple of things that are important as we go through. But if you get a little bit confused with whose son is whom, then that's the place to go in the genealogies. So we know that Jehoiaz is on the throne and he's going to be a short time on the throne. And then Jehoiakim is going to be put on the throne. His name was Eliakim. It gets changed to Jehoiakim. But I want to really pick up the story for a few minutes with the prophet Jeremiah, because we haven't spoken about him yet, and he's central during this time. He actually begins his ministry during the time of Josiah, and he's going to continue all the way through until the exile. He has messages, words to say to these kings about God's judgment coming upon them and so forth. But I want to just highlight a few things about Jeremiah that helps us understand these final days of the kingdom and really what's going wrong with God's people and why does the judgment come about. So Jeremiah chapter 1 gives us the call narrative, and this helps us actually understand his message, that has both an aspect of judgment but also restoration. And I want to just focus on both of those elements for a few moments, and then we'll pick up the story back in the king's narrative. So Jeremiah is ministering at this time, and if you look at Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 10, this is a key verse to help you understand the prophet. And he says, "I have appointed you this day over the nations and over kingdoms." And then we have this language: to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow. But we also have to build and to plant. So this is his ministry. He's going to have a ministry to the nations. He's going to pronounce judgment against them, but he's primarily going to be pronouncing judgment against the southern kingdom, and he is also going to give a word of restoration. So I'm going to focus just on a couple of chapters that especially if you're reading through Jeremiah, I would encourage you to read Jeremiah perhaps 1 to 11 is a great place to really get a sense of what the prophet is saying to God's people. One of the things he says in Jeremiah chapter 3 is he talks about the fact that he describes them as playing the harlot. And you're going to see this in Jeremiah and also in Ezekiel, that the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are called as metaphor two women kind of playing the harlot after other lovers. And this is really picking up the theme of idolatry. But the reason I mention it here is both of the prophets are going to say that Judah is even worse than the northern kingdom. And we saw 200 years of idolatry in the north, and now they are said to be even worse. So I want to also highlight Jeremiah chapter 7 and then Jeremiah chapter 11. Again, there are many others that we could look at, but these two will help us. So in Jeremiah chapter 7, he is going to underscore the sin that has been taking place within Jerusalem. And he says in verse 5, "If you truly amend your ways, and if you practice justice between a man and his neighbor, and if you don't oppress the alien and the orphan and the innocent, and return to the Lord," then he says, then there's going to be this restoration. But the reality is God's people will not return to him. He picks up the covenant that was made way back during the time of Moses. And he says, "What did I ask you?" He said, verse 23, he said, "This is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. and you will walk in the way which I command you. Verse 24, yet they did not obey, or incline their ear. They walked after their own counsels, after the stubbornness of their evil heart. And then he says this, verse 25 of chapter 7, since the days that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent you all my servants the prophets. Yet they did not listen or incline their ear, but they stiffened their neck, and they did more evil than their forefathers. And God says to Jeremiah, you need to speak their words to them, but they're not going to listen to you because they haven't been listening to me. And then he says in verse 28, you shall say to them, this is the nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord their God or accept correction. So that language of this is the nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord, that's picking up the Adam story. And it's reminding us that Adam is in Israel, and we get to see what the story of humanity is like by looking at the story of Israel. Then in chapter 10, there is a polemic against idolatry. And Jeremiah is going to contrast the living God with the idols that these people, the Israelites, have been worshipping. They're idols that cannot speak, they must be carried, they cannot even walk. But he says this is the living God. The Lord is the true and living God. And then in chapter 11, he then describes, and he basically says that the covenant that God has made with his people, picking up that Mosaic covenant. Do you remember many times ago, videos ago, we looked at in Exodus 20 and then Exodus 24, we looked at the covenant that God made with his people, and there when they said, we will obey the voice of the Lord. Not only that, but we saw at Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 27 and 28, we saw that the covenant had both blessings and curses, and the curses would come upon God's people if they failed to give heed to God's laws. And that is precisely where we are in the story right now, because Jeremiah is going to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 26, and he says in verse 3, Jeremiah 11, verse 3, cursed is the man who does not heed the words of this covenant, which I commanded your forefathers on the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, saying, listen to my voice. I warned you, verse 7, your fathers on the day that I brought them up from the land of Egypt, even to this day, warning them persistently, saying, listen to my voice. Yet they did not obey, or they did not incline their ear. They walked after other gods. Verse 10, they have broken the covenant. So this is absolutely devastating, because God's people have broken the covenant that they made at the time when they were brought out of the land of Egypt. They have broken it over and over through their idolatry. And see, the law is going to reveal that God's people are unable to keep the requirements of the law. And that's where the sin of Adam is being manifest in them. They're unable to keep it. And this is, of course, what Paul's going to say in Romans when he talks about all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so this is where this story now takes us, and the judgment, therefore, that comes upon God's people is going to be in the form of curses. And you'll read about this in passages like Jeremiah chapter 11. He's going to describe the sword and the beasts, and you're not going to be buried. All this is coming from Deuteronomy 28, curse language. But I also want to highlight that the prophet is not only to uproot, so he's going to describe the exile that's coming. He's going to talk about it being a 70-year period where God is reclaiming his sabbatical years. He's going to recognize that it's going to be 70 years, but then God is going to restore his people. He's to buy land as a deposit of what's ahead, the rest. So he's absolutely believing and knowing that God is going to restore his people. And one of the hopes of restoration in Jeremiah chapter 31 is that he says the days are coming when God is going to cut a new covenant with the house of Israel, and it's not like the old one. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their forefathers when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Verse 33, this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is the game changer. This is absolutely amazing with what God is promising here under the new covenant. In the study guide, I go through each one of these promises and I look at how the meaning of the promises and how they are being fulfilled under the new covenant that Jesus inaugurates. So don't miss this wonderful, but what I do want you to recognize here is that the solution to Israel's story is not renewal of the law and try harder. The solution to Israel's story is going to be, and their restoration is going to be the new covenant that God is going to establish, because the new covenant, he's going to do an internal work on their heart. This also gets picked up in Ezekiel chapter 36, which we'll look at, but he's going to do a new work in their heart. Instead of the tablets being written on external, they're going to be written on the human heart, and this is picking up the work of the Spirit. And so if you think of where we are now in our story, we've got hundreds of years to wait before we see the full restoration, because God's people are going to come back into Jerusalem. There's going to be a renewal of the temple. There's going to be covenant renewal. But this new covenant, the Old Testament finishes, and there is no establishment of the new covenant, because this ultimately is going to be fulfilled when Jesus, when he's about to go to the cross, and he says to his disciples, "Behold the blood of the new covenant." That was the language that Moses had used in Exodus 24. Behold the blood of the covenant. But unlike the covenant in Exodus 24 that was a blood of an animal, Jesus is referring to his own blood. And what does he say? Behold the blood of the covenant for the forgiveness of sins. In other words, the promise here in verse 34, God says, "I will forgive your sins and I will remember them no more." When Jesus holds the cup and he says, "Behold the blood of the new covenant," he is referring to his own death that is going to inaugurate the covenant. And his death, his sacrificial death, his atoning death, is going to be the means by which the promise of the new covenant is brought to fruition. And so I want you to really ponder and think about this, the significance of what Jesus is going to do as he establishes the new covenant and grants forgiveness. That's why we're not living in this narrative anymore. This is the hope that is being set forth, and this is the hope that comes to fruition with the coming of Jesus. I also want to highlight in Jeremiah, there is also the restoration of the Davidic king. And in Jeremiah chapter 33, he says, "Behold the days," verse 14, "are coming when I will fulfill the good word which I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and Judah. In those days I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he will execute righteousness and justice." You see, the prophets are looking forward to a righteous Davidic king, especially when we're in this last time period where there are no righteous Davidic kings, and they are longing for it in fulfillment of God's promises given to David. And so Jeremiah is going to announce both of those as the prophetic hope for the future. So we're going to conclude our section on Kings by looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and I'm just going to summarize it for you in terms of what happens next. So this tumultuous time period ushers in the final days of the southern kingdom. And we have every king, you'll see this on your timeline, every king does what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and yet finally it's going to come to an end, but there is going to be hope with King Jehoiachin, and we're going to pick that up when we come to the restoration. So keep an eye out on King Jehoiachin. But amidst these evil kings, God's judgment is going to come against Jerusalem in 586 BC. You read about it in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and in 2 Kings chapter 25. And what happens is the last king, Zedekiah, will not humble himself before the Lord. Prophets have come. He will not listen to Jeremiah. And so he also breaks covenant with Nebuchadnezzar. And so the Babylonians come against Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the city. They are going to destroy the temple. We're going to pick this up in the next narrative because we'll look at the prophet Ezekiel and what he sees to do with the temple. They're going to destroy the temple, and God's people are going to go into exile. Not only that, but the last king Zedekiah, who has broken covenant with Nebuchadnezzar, he flees. They chase after him. A number of people get slaughtered at this time in terms of key leaders. And Zedekiah, they kill his 70 sons, and then they gouge out his own eyes. And he goes out to Babylon in the dark. It's a tragic, tragic story. And of course, we have to ask the question, what happens to the promises God has made to David if the last king Zedekiah, if all his sons are killed? Well, I want you to notice that Zedekiah is the uncle of Jehoiachin. If you look on the timeline, you're going to see the arrow goes to Jehoiachin, moves forward, because we're going to see that his line is going to continue in Babylon, and that is how the line is going to be taken up in the story that follows. So it's a great story as we continue to look at what happens next.